My name is Kelsey Whitaker. I'm 29 years old and I live in Savannah, Georgia. The night everything finally broke, my focus was locked on one thing. A specialist visit I'd been waiting months to get. It was marked on the calendar by the fridge, the only plan in that house that was actually for me. Dinner had the usual chaos before one of my younger sister's performances. I was trying to finish my meal and keep a low profile when she turned toward me like I was something that needed correcting. She didn't ask if I could reschedule my appointment. She simply treated my health like it was flexible. Cancel it. You're coming to my show, she said as if the decision was already made. When I said no, the quiet that followed was heavier than anything she'd said. Forks froze and my parents looked at me like I'd crossed an invisible line. My sister reacted first. Her hand hit my face so fast my chair scraped across the tile. My parents didn't stop her. They didn't ask why I needed that appointment or what I was scared about. They just reminded me that this night was important for her and that doctors could always wait. That my plans were the ones that didn't matter. As my cheek burned, it finally clicked. If I stayed, I was accepting that my health and my future were optional. So I grabbed my keys and wallet, pushed my chair back and walked out. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I left, tell me what time it is for you right now. And where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story reaches. By the time the sky over Savannah went dark, I was still clutching the steering wheel like I didn't know how to let go. I didn't have a plan when I walked out of that house. I knew I wasn't going back inside. My cheek pulsed, my jaw hummed, and the word appointment kept blinking in my mind like a hazard light. For the first time in my life, I had marked a date that was mine, not someone else's. And I wasn't moving it again. There were only two places I could land that night. A rundown motel near the highway, or the one apartment in this city where I wouldn't feel like dead weight. I stopped at a red light, lifted my phone and stared at a single name in my recent calls. Jordan Price and I had crossed paths at work a couple of years earlier. We both dealt with guest complaints at a riverfront hotel, the kind of job where you grin at tourists all day and get home too drained to speak. Somewhere between double shifts and late-night issues, Jordan became the only person in Savannah who ever asked how I was and stayed quiet long enough to hear it. I didn't explain what had just gone down at dinner. I didn't bring up the slap or how my parents had looked at me like I was wrong for wanting to see a specialist. I sent one brief text asking if Jordan's offer from months back was still good. The one about the couch being there if I ever needed out. The response came almost immediately. A short yes and an apartment number. That was all I needed. I drove across town with the numb focus that kicks in when a breakdown has to wait. Stepping into Jordan's building felt like slipping out of a part I'd been cast in my whole life. No framed shots of my sister in dance outfits lining the walls. No pile of bills on the counter with my name attached. No running list of chores taped to the fridge in my handwriting. Just silence and the sound of my own breath. I set my overnight bag down and finally checked my phone. Missed calls filled the screen. My mom, my dad, my sister. The voicemails could sit. I knew that script by heart. Guilt. Bigger. The reminder that my sister Madeline's big night mattered more than anything going on with my health. Growing up, that rule never had to be written. If it came down to my plans or my sister's rehearsal, her rehearsal always won. If there was money for my car insurance or her new costume, my payment waited and the costume got bought. When I moved back home after college for what was supposed to be a few months, it turned into years of covering utilities and loan bills while everyone talked about how lucky Madeline was to be talented. The appointment I'd scheduled wasn't just a routine checkup. I'd spent weeks fighting with insurance during my lunch breaks, sitting on hold just to get a referral cleared. The symptoms had crept in quietly. A level of exhaustion sleep never fixed. A sharp ache in my side that showed up and disappeared. A blood test that made my primary doctor uneasy. When the specialist's office finally offered me an opening, it was 3 months away. I wrote it on the calendar and promised myself nothing would interfere with it. Nothing apparently except my sister's show. Sitting on Jordan's couch that night, wrapped in a blanket that didn't carry the smell of my childhood home, I saw how often I'd buried my own needs. I'd pushed dental appointments back so I could drive Madeline to extra rehearsals. I'd canceled therapy sessions to work overtime when my parents fell short on the mortgage. I'd trained myself to label my fears as overreactions because that's how everyone at the dinner table dismissed them. This time felt different. I could feel it in the tightness in my chest every time I imagined skipping that appointment. Somewhere inside me was a boundary I hadn't known was there. And that night I finally crossed it. Before lying down, I set my alarm for the morning and checked the clinic address again. It felt unfamiliar and a little frightening to plan a day centered only on my health, not my sister's calendar or my parents' crises. For the first time in years, I chose to show up for myself even if no one else did. Morning crept over Savannah before I felt ready to move. My phone alarm went off on Jordan's couch, and for a moment I stayed still, listening to the air conditioner buzz. Then the soreness in my cheek and the tight knot in my stomach reminded me why I wasn't in my own bed. I had a specialist appointment and I was going to get there whether my family approved or not. I cleaned up, changed into fresh clothes from my overnight bag, and drove across town to the clinic. The place was small and unremarkable, tucked between a strip mall and a parking structure. Inside, I checked in, handed over my insurance card, and took a seat in a row of rigid chairs beneath a TV looping a segment about vacation destinations. Most people there weren't alone. A woman around my age sat with an older man. Another patient leaned close to someone who was likely a spouse. I filled out my paperwork by myself, circling symptoms and signing my name until it barely looked familiar. A nurse called me back and guided me down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant. She slipped the cuff around my arm, recorded my blood pressure, asked routine questions, and typed everything in without comment. A few minutes later, the doctor came in, composed and businesslike, reviewing my chart as if we were talking about a routine check instead of my body. He asked about the fatigue, the on and off pain, the abnormal blood work my primary doctor had flagged. He explained the need for more labs and imaging, about eliminating simple causes before jumping to anything serious. There were no speeches, just straightforward directions and more appointments I was expected to keep. When it ended, I walked out with a small bandage on my arm and several papers tucked into my bag. The major answers would come later. But one thing was clear. I had finally put my own health on the calendar and no one had erased it. In the parking garage, I unlocked my car and my phone lit up before I could turn the key. Missed calls from home lined the screen, but one alert sat above them from my credit union. The subject read, "Unusual application activity." I almost swiped past it. Then I noticed my full name in the preview and the last 4 digits of my social security number. The message said a new line of credit had been applied for in my name the night before. If I hadn't submitted it, I needed to call right away. I hadn't applied for anything. The only choice I'd made the night before was walking out of my parents' house. I tapped the number from the email. After a short wait, a woman answered and introduced herself as Dawn Keller from the fraud department. Her calm tone steadied me enough that my hands stopped trembling. She confirmed my identity by asking about past addresses and old loan amounts, then pulled up the flagged application on her screen. She read through the details: my job, my parents' address, my phone number. Someone had pieced the application together using fragments of my life and tried to claim it as mine. When she asked if I had submitted it, I said no. The word sounded flat, but it felt like crossing another point of no return. Dawn shifted into process. She walked me through placing a freeze on my credit so no new accounts could be opened. She instructed me to add fraud alerts with the major bureaus and to pull a full credit report as soon as we ended the call. As we spoke, I logged into the site on my phone. The report loaded in sections: accounts, balances, payment histories. Some were cards I recognized, ones I'd opened myself when money was tight. Others weren't. A retail account linked to a dancewear company I'd never shopped with. A financing plan for sound equipment. A travel card with charges in cities that lined up with my sister's recent shows. Every account carried my name and my social security number. By the time I reached the bottom of the report, the balances on those unfamiliar lines totaled more than I'd made in several years. I stared at the numbers, the bandage on my arm itching beneath my sleeve, and listened while Dawn walked me through what came next. When the call ended, I stayed in the driver's seat with the engine off, my phone warm in my palm, my lab orders resting on the passenger seat. In a single morning, both my health and my credit had turned into crises. I couldn't delay or give up anything anymore for someone else's schedule. Later that day, the heat and Savannah weighed against the windshield as I pulled away from the clinic lot. My credit report was still open on my phone. Rows of debt lined the screen next to my name. Dancewear, sound equipment, travel charges that mirrored my sister's show calendar. None of it was mine, yet all of it was attached to me. As long as my life stayed connected to that house, I was vulnerable. My paperwork, my mail, every detail someone could use to open another account was still sitting in their drawers. If I wanted any chance of fixing this, I had to start by taking those things back. I drove to my parents' street with the AC blasting and my jaw clenched. At the front door, my key turned halfway before hitting the deadbolt. I paused with my hand on the knob, then pressed the doorbell. Footsteps moved down the hall. The door opened just enough to leave a narrow gap. My mother filled it, one hand braced on the wood. Her eyes shifted from my face to the folder tucked under my arm and the overnight bag on my shoulder. She didn't move aside. I told her I was there for my documents and my mail, and that I'd return for the rest of my belongings another time. I kept my voice level like I was handling a checkout issue at the hotel. My father stepped up behind her, peering over her shoulder. He asked why I was turning finances into drama when everything was still under the same roof. He reminded me they'd taken me back in after college when I couldn't afford a place of my own. I thought about the years I'd covered mortgage payments and the balances I'd just discovered. I told them there were accounts under my name that I had never approved. I said my credit was now locked and that any future attempts using my information would set off alerts. My mother's face went cold. She said I was overreacting, that families used the most reliable name for applications all the time, that it was simply more convenient. She called it family business and said involving banks was a betrayal. I noticed movement on the staircase. My sister Madeline was leaning on the railing in her rehearsal clothes, makeup only half finished. The moment she saw me, irritation crossed her face. She said this was the worst time for unnecessary drama, that influential people were watching her shows, that I was putting everything she'd worked for at risk. She never asked why my bank believed someone was impersonating me. I didn't offer more explanation. I'd spent years defending every choice in that hallway and nothing had ever shifted. I only repeated that I wanted my documents and any mail with my name on it. Then I gestured toward the small table by the stairs where a stack of envelopes rested. My mother paused, then opened the door a bit more and stepped aside without letting me inside. She flipped through the pile while I stared at the wall behind her. Photos of Madeline on stage filled most of the space. My own college graduation picture was barely visible near the bottom. She shoved a thick bundle of envelopes into my hand so roughly that several bent. She said if I kept dealing with banks and investigators, I shouldn't expect to come back and find my room still there. My father added that choosing to walk away from their support meant choosing to walk away from the family. I told them that any account with my name on it was my responsibility and that was exactly why I would no longer allow anyone else to open or use anything tied to my identity. I said I would not cover debts I never agreed to and I would not live in a house where my health and my name were treated like leverage. They asked where I thought I was going and how I expected to survive without them. I didn't answer. Nothing I could say would ever make them see me as more than something they were about to lose access to. I adjusted the folder tighter under my arm, pressed the envelopes against my chest and stepped off the porch. The door shut behind me with a hard final sound. Inside the car, my hands trembled as I placed the mail on the passenger seat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin again. Proof of who I was and the first real space between me and the house that had never treated me like a daughter. A few days later, the clinic called while I was sitting at Jordan's kitchen table. Mail from my parents' house was spread out in front of me next to the credit report Jordan had helped me pull. Envelopes with my name were lined up beside a notepad where I had started listing accounts to dispute and numbers to contact. I was trying to turn a mess into steps I could actually complete. When my phone lit up with the clinic's number, the room felt suddenly smaller. A nurse confirmed my identity and passed me to the doctor. His tone stayed steady as he went over the results, talking through markers and scans I barely followed. Then he said a word that didn't need explaining. He told me the abnormal cells matched a blood cancer that required treatment. Rest wouldn't solve it. Time wouldn't make it disappear. He laid out imaging, more labs, and a referral to an oncologist in the city. Chemotherapy was likely. He spoke in timelines measured in months. I wrote as he talked, pressing the pen so hard it almost tore the page. When the call ended, the kitchen went quiet again. On the table, the financial checklist I'd made now sat beside a new section. Appointments to schedule and paperwork to gather. Jordan came in from the hallway, took one look at my face and sat down across from me. I didn't repeat the word the doctor had used, but it was there between us all the same. They asked what would happen next. I explained that there would be more testing followed by treatment. I said I would need time away from work and that expenses would keep coming no matter what. That afternoon, I dialed the number on the back of my insurance card. A representative walked me through deductibles, out-of-pocket limits, and what my plan would cover for oncology care. The numbers were steep even with insurance. As she spoke, my mind kept drifting back to the unauthorized charges showing up on my credit report. My job at the hotel had never felt critical until I understood how much I would depend on it. After my shift, I asked my manager, Alvarez, if I could speak with her privately. I told her I'd been diagnosed with something serious and would need some flexibility while going through treatment. She listened without cutting me off, asked what the next few months might involve, and brought up medical leave options the company had available. In the evenings, between work shifts and phone calls, I followed the steps Dawn had laid out for me. I completed an identity theft affidavit, listed account numbers, and printed statements showing charges I didn't recognize. I placed everything into a folder that grew thicker every night. The calls from my parents kept coming. Some messages were harsh, accusing me of turning minor financial help into criminal accusations. Others were almost soft. My mother said the bank had called about frozen applications and closed cards. She said I'd gone too far and should come home so we could clear up the misunderstanding together. She never asked how my test had gone. My sister's voice showed up later in a voicemail that came through while I was folding laundry in Jordan's living room. Madeline didn't mention my health once. She talked about directors and sponsors, about how hard it was to explain declined payments and canceled reservations. She said people were beginning to whisper that our family couldn't be trusted. She finished by saying I was ruining her reputation in the local arts scene. Sitting on the edge of the couch with my phone still in my hand, I finally faced something I'd been dodging. As long as everything stayed within the family, my parents and my sister would keep treating my health and my credit like inconveniences I had caused myself. In their eyes, I wasn't a victim of fraud. I was the problem for refusing to stay silent. The next morning, I grabbed the folder and drove toward downtown Savannah. Instead of heading toward my parents' neighborhood, I pulled up in front of a low brick building with a small sign that read police. Inside, a clerk at the front desk handed me a form and asked what brought me in. I told her I needed to report identity theft. She slid a pen toward me. I sat down and began squeezing the story of my life into boxes and lines on a page. When an officer called my name and led me into a smaller room to talk, I placed the folder on the table between us and opened it. For years, my family had insisted our issues were private. Now, page by page, I was turning those secrets into evidence. The report didn't vanish into a drawer. Within a week, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. The officer introduced himself as Detective Reed from Financial Crimes. He said my case lined up with other complaints connected to the same address and asked if I could come in with my paperwork so it could be added to the file. I brought the folder back to the station and sat in another small room with a recorder sitting on the table. Detective Reed asked when I'd moved back home who paid the bills, whose names were listed on which accounts. He was calm, but he didn't soften his language. He called it fraud. He called it identity theft. Hearing those words from someone in uniform made it impossible to brush this off as a simple mix-up. He pushed a printed packet across the table. Charges from multiple store accounts were listed down the page. Costume purchases, lighting rentals, travel reservations tied to Madeline's performance locations. My name appeared at the top of every page, but the shipping addresses pointed to my parents' house and the studios where my sister trained. When I stepped out of the station, the streets looked unchanged, but the version of my life I'd grown up believing no longer did. From the outside, it all looked deliberate. Over the next few days, envelopes started showing up at Jordan's apartment. Creditors confirmed they'd received my disputes and that investigations were underway. Some accounts were frozen. Others were shut down while they determined who was responsible for the balances. At the same time, the messages from my parents took a different tone. My mother left a voicemail saying collection letters were arriving at the house and accusing me of leaving them stuck with debt they couldn't manage. My father texted that I'd crossed a line by involving outsiders in family business. Neither of them asked whether I'd begun treatment. Madeline messaged once, talking about a director who'd withdrawn support for an upcoming show after hearing rumors about unpaid bills. She said sponsors were uneasy about being linked to a family under scrutiny for fraud and ended by saying it was clear some people didn't care if she ever moved beyond local stages. Reading it, I felt the old guilt tugging at my resolve. For years, that was where I gave in, convincing myself that giving up a little more would keep everything calm. This time, the figures on my credit report and the doctor's voice on the phone didn't leave space for that lie. At Dawn's urging, I scheduled a visit with a legal aid clinic downtown. The attorney explained what might come next. If investigators found sufficient proof, charges could follow. Restitution could be ordered. There were also ways to set limits, including measures to restrict contact if the pressure continued. The language sounded severe even though the attorney spoke evenly. I sat in the molded plastic chair and listened as someone with no personal ties referred to my parents as alleged offenders. A part of me wanted to protest. Another part of me understood they had never once hesitated to see me as a source of money. I walked away with a folder of documents and the card of a victim advocate tucked inside. On the sidewalk beneath a spreading live oak, I stopped and took a deeper breath than I had in days. I wasn't facing this by myself anymore. That night I blocked my parents' phone numbers. I set filters so their emails went straight into a folder I didn't need to open. In one short message sent before the block, I told them that any questions about the accounts had to go through the bank, the police, or a lawyer. I didn't wait to hear back. My life settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around my family. Mornings were for lab work, scans, and insurance calls. Afternoons were spent at the hotel when I felt well enough to work. Evenings were for rest, paperwork, and whatever was on the TV in Jordan's living room. One afternoon, an official envelope from the county arrived. Inside was a notice stating that formal charges had been filed related to the accounts opened in my name. My parents appeared on separate lines, each tied to specific counts that spelled out exactly what they had done. I stood at the kitchen counter and read every word. For the first time, the consequences of their choices were written in a form they couldn't wave off as me being dramatic. It wasn't just my version of events anymore. It was a case number, and there was no way back to the version of family they had tried to preserve. The first court date fell on a morning that looked completely normal. By then, chemo sessions and lab visits had carved my week into appointments and recovery days. I moved more slowly, got tired more easily, and carried a tote with a blanket and paperwork everywhere I went. My body wanted rest, but my name was on the case, so I walked into the courthouse. Standing up for myself had stopped being something I was willing to bargain over. A clerk verified my ID and directed me upstairs. I sat on a hard wooden bench and located the line where my parents' names appeared beneath the word defendant. I'd seen those names on permission slips and birthday cards my entire life. Seeing them printed there shattered any last belief that this was still just a private family matter. It was now the state of Georgia versus the people who raised me. Inside the courtroom, my parents sat beside their lawyers. My father's shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. My mother's makeup was flawless, but her hands would not stay steady. My sister sat behind them by herself, spine perfectly straight, eyes fixed on the judge instead of the room. No one turned around to find me. The judge read the charges in an even, practiced tone. Fraud, identity theft, use of personal information without consent. The prosecutor laid out the pattern investigators had uncovered: applications submitted using my social security number, store cards connected to costume purchases and equipment rentals, travel charges matching my sister's shows, all traced back to the address where I had been covering household bills. When my name was called, I stepped forward and raised my hand. I confirmed which accounts I had opened and which ones I had never recognized. I explained how the bills and collection calls started, how I ran my credit report, how the fraud alert arrived the same week I was scheduling cancer treatment. I kept my responses brief and factual. The court didn't need every painful line spoken in my parents' kitchen to understand the figures. The judge asked what I wanted from the outcome. I said I wanted the fraudulent debt removed from my record. I wanted the money I had already paid returned to me. I wanted a written order stating that no one could ever use my identity again without my permission. I didn't ask for apologies, counseling, or another attempt at being a whole family. Courts issue orders, not healing. A few weeks later, both of my parents accepted plea agreements. My father pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to time in county custody, followed by years of supervision and restitution. My mother admitted to several lesser offenses, receiving probation, community service, and the same financial responsibilities. The house I had helped keep afloat was ordered sold so the proceeds could be applied toward what they owed. For the first time, the consequences of their decisions landed somewhere other than my finances and my body. From there, the systems started to correct themselves. Fraudulent accounts were shut down or wiped from my credit history. Not every mark vanished, but the heaviest burden finally lifted. In the courthouse hallway after sentencing, my parents passed by surrounded by attorneys and officers. My father kept his eyes forward and my mother looked right through me as if I wasn't there. No one reached for me and I didn't move. In the months that came next, my sister tried to close the gap with new phone numbers and long messages. She talked about canceled performances, sponsors pulling out, and directors in Savannah who no longer wanted their projects linked to a family with felony charges. She mentioned my treatment once before turning the focus back to how this had damaged her reputation. I left every message unanswered. Silence was the one boundary she couldn't bend. When my lease began on a small apartment across town, Jordan and a few co-workers helped me haul thrift store furniture and boxes inside. The place was simple, but every key, paper, and bill belonged to me. No one else stored their documents in my drawers or signed their name on my lines. My health is still something I handle week by week, with good days and days I cancel everything. I don't apologize anymore for putting my body and my future first. I used to believe that walking away from your parents meant failing as a daughter. Now I understand the real failure would have been staying and letting them keep spending my life on someone else's spotlight. Leaving didn't make me heartless. It made me honest about what my time and health are worth. If any of this feels uncomfortably familiar, I hope you remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish. People who truly care will learn to respect your limits. People who only valued what you gave them will call those limits betrayal. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If my story made you reflect on your own boundaries or family dynamics, you can share your thoughts below or pass this along to someone who might need it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to stay. For me, the real win wasn't the verdict or the paperwork, but finally living like my life is mine and refusing to hand that choice back.